Hey, this is Chris. In this lecture, I'll show you what you need to do to speed up Photoshop. If you're not interested, just skip to the next lecture. The first thing you want to do is get 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. From my experience, anything over 16 won't do you any good unless you're a professional who's doing this for the living. Now, your graphics card doesn't matter all that much. So if you're on a tight budget, you can use an Intel CPU which has an integrated graphics card. This means you don't need to get a separate one. Having said that, I still recommend you get one, but don't aim for the latest and greatest. Look for the top selling one, which is usually a great choice. As far as your processor or your CPU, this is a complicated subject, but here's my conclusion. For Photoshop, Intel processors are far better than AMD ones. So if you want the absolute best Photoshop processor, go with an Intel one. Now I'll get a bit more technical. I'm saying that even though AMD's Threadripper looks just amazing. Even the Ryzen lineup seems fantastic if you consider the price to performance ratio. But here's the catch. Photoshop isn't optimized for multi-core use. And that's the main advantage of AMD's chips. Actually, Photoshop seems to heavily rely on the frequency of one core. In general, Intel processors have higher clock speeds than those from AMD. My 7700K runs at 4.2 GHz out of the box, but the Ryzen 1800X runs at only 3.6. So Photoshop cares who offers the higher clock speed, and that's Intel. So it doesn't really matter how many extra cores AMD gives you. Photoshop just doesn't care. Plus, you can easily overclock Intel processors that have a K at the end. This means my computer is actually running at 4.8, which makes a big difference actually. Okay, I hope I didn't lose you there, but I had to justify my conclusion. Let's go back to Photoshop. Press Ctrl or Command K and this will show you your preferences. From this list on the left, choose Performance. From here you should increase your memory usage to about 60 to 70% depending on how much you multitask. If you have a lot of demanding programs running in the background, you might want to input a lower value. Now in the history states, this refers to the number of times you can undo. I know you may be tempted to bump up this slider, but that will require more power from your computer. My advice is you limit it to 20 or 25 states. On the left side, you may be wondering what this is all about. In short, if you use lots of small layers, use the Web/UI design option. If you're a photographer who often works with huge images, the last one will be your go-to choice. If you're somewhere in the middle, well, the default value is best for you. I personally use the first option. One of the major boosts you can give to your computer is installing an SSD. Most users know that SSDs are much faster than regular hard disk drives, but here's the catch. If you want Photoshop to truly benefit from your lightning fast SSD, you have to use it as a scratch disk. That's available immediately under Performance. Scratch disks are used by Photoshop when you run out of RAM. The more empty space it has, the better. That means you're better off installing Photoshop and various other programs on your hard drive and keeping your SSD mostly empty in order to use it as a scratch disk. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but installing Photoshop on your SSD won't make a notable difference in performance. In general, leaving Photoshop aside, most SSDs perform worse as you fill them up. Some argue that by having it over 50% full, you're slowing it down considerably. Of course, this varies from brand to brand, model to model. I wouldn't worry too much as long as you have at least 40 GB of free space on your SSD. In case you have several partitions, which I don't recommend, you can enable them by checking their respective boxes. One solid piece of advice is to make sure you have them stacked in the correct order. So if your SSD is the third option in the list, click it and use this up arrow to change its position to number 1. Let's close this window and open up a new project with Ctrl N. Just hit Create and don't worry about the rest. Focus on the bottom left side. From this area, click and hold on this tiny icon. Okay, from this list, choose Efficiency. This should ideally show 100% as you continue to work. If the value in the indicator is below 100%, Photoshop has used all the available RAM and is using your scratch disk. That's not ideal because your RAM is much faster than your SSD even if you're using a high-end model. If you've set your memory usage to anything under 70%, now's the time to increase it. If this value falls under 90%, you'll start to feel Photoshop slow down. If that's the case, you have only two options. You either close some programs or you add more RAM to your computer. Lastly, stay away from laptops unless you really need them. Laptops are the money pit and they're a very bad choice. I could spend at least a half an hour on the subject, but here's the main ideas in short. First of all, the CPUs. They're vastly different and underpowered. So while it may say i7 or i5 on the box, it's a completely different CPU than what you get in a desktop computer. The difference in performance is night and day. The same applies for graphic cards. Moving on, if you do a lot of research and let's say you pick a good CPU, it will drain your battery like crazy. I do have an Ultrabook with one of the biggest batteries on the market, but it's still not good enough for any decent amount of work. Another point is the displays. They're either too small or they have poor color rendition. So to sum it up, a $2,000 laptop is miles behind a $2,000 desktop. But again, if you really need it because you travel a lot or whatever, then please do as much research as possible. Okay, these are my tips for getting the most out of Photoshop. As we go along, you'll find more tips about the subject, so stay tuned. Before you continue with the next lecture, open Photoshop, use Ctrl or Command K, and make sure your settings are good to go. I'll see you soon.